In 1962, during the height of the Cold War space race, a recording surfaced within the classified archives of the Soviet space program that would challenge everything the world believed about humanity's first ventures beyond Earth's atmosphere. The recording, labeled only as Cosmonaut Zero, contained audio transmissions from what appeared to be an undocumented orbital mission. What made this recording particularly disturbing was not the technical failures it documented, but the psychological deterioration of an unnamed cosmonaut whose identity was systematically erased from all official records. The story begins in the remote training facility of Star City, located 60 kilometers northeast of Moscow. In the winter of 1959, the facility operated under such strict secrecy that even its existence was known only to a handful of Soviet officials. It was here that candidates for the space program underwent psychological and physical testing that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Among these candidates was a man whose name would later be deliberately obscured from all documentation, referred to in whispered conversations only as Cosmonaut Zero. According to fragmented personnel files discovered decades later, Cosmonaut Zero was selected not for his exceptional skills, but for his complete lack of family connections or social ties. Born in a rural village near Volgograd, he had been orphaned during the war and raised in state institutions. His psychological profile, marked with red ink in the margins, noted an unusual capacity for isolation and an almost pathological dedication to duty. These traits, which might have disqualified other candidates, made him perfect for what the program directors had in mind. The official Soviet narrative of their space program spoke of triumphant achievements and heroic cosmonauts who returned as national heroes. Yuri Gagarin's successful orbital flight in 1961 had been celebrated worldwide as a victory for Soviet engineering and human courage. However, buried within the classified archives was evidence of earlier attempts, missions that never appeared in any public record. The recordings suggest that Cosmonaut Zero's flight occurred somewhere between 1960 and 1961, during a period that official timelines describe as intensive preparation phase. Training logs from Star City, discovered during a routine archive transfer in 1968, contained disturbing references to psychological conditioning experiments. The documents described isolation chambers where candidates were sealed for weeks at a time, subjected to sensory deprivation and audio loops designed to test their mental resilience. One particular entry, dated December 19, 1959, noted that Cosmonaut Zero had remained conscious and responsive after 43 days in complete darkness. The entry was signed by Dr. Alexei Volkov, a psychiatrist whose own records were mysteriously destroyed in a fire at the facility in 1963. The psychological preparation extended beyond mere endurance testing. According to testimony given by a former technician who fled to the West in 1964, the program included experiments in what they termed cognitive isolation. Cosmonauts were trained to function in environments where normal human communication was impossible, where the silence of space would be their only companion for extended periods. The technician, identified only as Source K in CIA debriefing documents, claimed that some candidates emerged from this training fundamentally changed, as if something essential in their humanity had been deliberately suppressed. The training facility itself reflected this atmosphere of calculated dehumanization. Built in the style of Soviet brutalist architecture, its concrete corridors echoed with the sound of footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The isolation chambers were located in the basement level, accessible only through a series of airlocks that created an almost submarine-like environment. Former personnel described the oppressive silence that pervaded these lower levels. broken only by the mechanical hum of life support systems and the occasional muffled sound that might have been human voices, though no one could ever be certain. Cosmonaut Zero's final evaluation, conducted in March 1960, painted a portrait of a man who had been systematically stripped of individual identity. The evaluating physician noted that the candidate responded to questions with mechanical precision, but showed no emotional variation in his responses. His pulse remained steady, even during stress tests that typically induced panic responses in other subjects. Most disturbing was his apparent acceptance of the possibility that his mission might be one way, a contingency that the program directors discussed openly in his presence. The launch itself took place at a secondary facility in Kazakhstan, far from the primary Baikonur Cosmodrome that would later become famous for Gagarin's historic flight. The location, known in documents only as Site 17, was constructed specifically for experimental missions that carried higher risks than the program was willing to acknowledge publicly. The facility was staffed by personnel who had signed agreements binding them to absolute silence, agreements that included provisions for their families to be relocated if they violated their oath of secrecy. On the morning of the launch, weather conditions were reported as marginal, with low clouds and intermittent radio interference that would make communication difficult. According to the mission log, this was considered acceptable because the primary objective was not communication with ground control, but the collection of physiological and psychological data from an isolated human subject in orbital conditions. The rocket used was a modified version of the standard Soviet launch vehicle, equipped with additional life support systems designed to sustain a human occupant for up to 2 weeks in orbit. The launch proceeded without apparent technical difficulties. Radio telemetry indicated normal separation of the orbital module and successful achievement of stable orbit at an altitude of approximately 200 kilometers above Earth. For the first 6 hours of the mission, all systems functioned within acceptable parameters. Cosmonaut Zero's vital signs remained stable, and his few radio transmissions consisted of routine status reports delivered in the same mechanical tone that had characterized his responses during training. The first indication that something had gone wrong came during the 8th hour of the mission, when ground control attempted to establish radio contact for a scheduled systems check. Instead of the expected response, they received only static, punctuated by what the duty officer described as breathing that didn't sound quite right. When contact was finally established, Cosmonaut Zero's voice had changed in subtle but disturbing ways. His speech patterns remained precise, but there was an underlying quality that the communications technician later described as resembling someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. The psychological deterioration began gradually, almost imperceptibly. During the second day of the mission, Cosmonaut Zero began reporting sensory experiences that had no basis in the physical reality of his orbital environment. He described hearing voices, speaking in languages he didn't recognize, coming from outside the spacecraft. He reported seeing lights moving in patterns that suggested intelligence, though no other objects were detected by radar or visual observation from the ground. Ground control initially attributed these reports to the known effects of sensory deprivation and the stress of orbital flight. However, the consistency and detail of Cosmonaut Zero's descriptions suggested something more complex than simple hallucinations. He began to speak of conversations he was having with entities he could not see, responding to questions that no one else could hear. His responses during these apparent conversations revealed information about classified aspects of the space program that he should not have known, suggesting that his psychological state was accessing memories or knowledge that had been suppressed during his conditioning. By the 3rd day of the mission, the nature of the transmissions had changed entirely. Cosmonaut Zero's reports became increasingly focused on what he described as the silence between the stars. He spoke of vast, empty spaces that seemed to be aware of his presence, of darkness that moved with purpose and intention. His descriptions were delivered in the same flat, mechanical tone he had always used, which made them even more disturbing to the ground control personnel who were monitoring the mission. The recordings from this period, preserved in the archives despite multiple attempts to destroy them, capture the gradual dissolution of human consciousness exposed to an environment for which it had never evolved. Cosmonaut Zero began to speak of Earth as something distant and irrelevant, describing the planet as the place where noise lives. He expressed increasing reluctance to return to what he called the weight of sound and breath, suggesting that the silence of space had become preferable to the chaotic sensory environment of terrestrial life. Ground control made several attempts to abort the mission and bring the orbital module back to Earth, but Cosmonaut Zero refused to activate the re-entry sequence. His responses to direct orders became increasingly erratic, though never aggressive or emotional. He simply stated that he was not finished listening yet, and that his mission required him to remain in orbit until he had heard everything the silence had to say. Indeed, the technical systems that would allow ground control to force re-entry had been deliberately disabled during the spacecraft's construction as part of the experimental protocol designed to test the cosmonaut's psychological independence. During the fourth day of the mission, the transmissions took on a quality that disturbed even the most hardened mission controllers. Cosmonaut Zero began to speak in voices that were not his own, repeating conversations that seemed to be taking place somewhere else entirely. He described meetings between Soviet officials that had occurred years before his birth, recounting details that were later verified against classified historical records. He spoke of future space missions with accuracy that would not be confirmed until years later, describing technical failures and personnel decisions that had not yet been made. The mission directors convened an emergency session to determine how to proceed. The recordings from this meeting, obtained through intelligence sources decades later, revealed the extent to which the space program had been designed as much for psychological experimentation as for technological advancement. Dr. Volkov argued that Cosmonaut Zero was providing unprecedented data about human consciousness under extreme isolation, and that the mission should be allowed to continue regardless of the personal cost to the subject. Other officials expressed concern about the political implications if news of the mission became public. The Soviet space program depended on maintaining an image of technological superiority and human triumph over natural limitations. A cosmonaut who had been driven insane by isolation in orbit would undermine the carefully constructed narrative of Soviet achievement in space exploration. The decision was made to continue monitoring the mission while preparing contingency plans for information control should the situation deteriorate further. Cosmonaut Zero's family records were systematically destroyed, and personnel who had been involved in his training were quietly transferred to other assignments, or in some cases simply disappeared from their posts. By the fifth day, the transmissions had become so disturbing that most of the ground control staff requested reassignment from the mission. Cosmonaut Zero had begun describing Earth's history from a perspective that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. He spoke of events that spanned geological epochs, describing the planet's formation and the emergence of life with detail that suggested direct observation rather than scientific knowledge. His descriptions of human civilization were particularly unsettling. He spoke of wars and disasters that had not yet occurred, describing them with the same detached precision he had always used for technical reports. He mentioned specific dates and locations for events that would not take place for decades, if at all. Those monitoring the transmissions began to wonder whether the isolation and sensory deprivation had somehow unlocked aspects of human consciousness that were normally suppressed by the constant stimulation of terrestrial life. The final recorded transmission from Cosmonaut Zero occurred on the morning of the sixth day, after nearly 12 hours of silence, during which ground control had begun to hope that the ordeal was over. His voice returned with a clarity and presence that it had not possessed since the early hours of the mission. He spoke directly to the monitoring station, addressing individual personnel by names that were not included in any mission documentation and should not have been known to him. In this final transmission, Cosmonaut Zero thanked each member of the ground control team for their service to what he called the necessary experiment. He explained that his mission had been successful beyond the expectations of its designers, and that the data he had collected would eventually contribute to humanity's understanding of consciousness and its relationship to the cosmos. He assured them that his isolation in orbit had not been suffering, but rather a form of education that had prepared him for what he described as the next phase of human development. The transmission ended with Cosmonaut Zero stating that he was ready to return to Earth, but that the person who would emerge from the orbital module would not be the same individual who had entered it. He activated the re-entry sequence with the same mechanical precision that had characterized his entire mission, and ground control tracked the module's descent through the atmosphere to its planned landing zone in the steppes of Kazakhstan. The recovery team that reached the landing site found the orbital module intact, with all systems functioning normally. However, when they opened the hatch, the interior was empty. Cosmonaut Zero's pressure suit remained in place, properly sealed and showing no signs of emergency evacuation. His restraint harnesses were still fastened, but there was no trace of the man who had worn them. The only evidence of his presence during the mission was a small notebook, filled with mathematical equations that would not be understood until the development of quantum consciousness theory, decades later. The investigation into Cosmonaut Zero's disappearance was conducted with the same secrecy that had surrounded his mission. The official report, classified at the highest levels of government, concluded that a technical malfunction had resulted in the subject's death, though it could not explain the absence of any physical remains. The mission was reclassified as an unmanned test flight, and all personnel involved were reassigned to other projects or retired from service. Dr. Volkov, who had advocated for the mission's continuation, submitted a final report that was sealed immediately upon its completion. The few fragments that survived subsequent document purges suggested that he believed Cosmonaut Zero had achieved a form of consciousness that transcended normal human limitations, becoming something that could exist independently of physical form. Volkov's own fate remained unclear, as his personnel file indicated that he had been transferred to a research facility in Siberia, but no records of his arrival at the destination were ever found. The orbital module was dismantled and its components studied extensively, but nothing unusual was discovered. The life support systems had functioned perfectly throughout the mission, maintaining atmospheric pressure and composition within acceptable parameters. The psychological monitoring equipment had recorded Cosmonaut Zero's vital signs until the moment of re-entry, showing no indication of medical crisis or system failure. In the years following the mission, several attempts were made to replicate the experimental conditions that had produced such dramatic results. However, none of the subsequent test subjects displayed anything approaching Cosmonaut Zero's psychological transformation. The combination of factors that had created his unique response to orbital isolation remained unclear, leading some researchers to conclude that his selection had been more precise than anyone had understood at the time. The recordings of Cosmonaut Zero's transmissions were preserved in multiple copies, stored in different locations to ensure their survival despite periodic attempts to destroy them. Researchers who gained access to these materials in later years noted the progressive change in the subject's voice and speech patterns, documenting what they termed linguistic evolution under extreme isolation. The recordings became a case study in the effects of sensory deprivation on human consciousness, though their full significance would not be recognized until the development of advanced neuroscience techniques decades later. Intelligence services from several nations eventually obtained copies of portions of the recordings, leading to classified research programs designed to understand the implications of Cosmonaut Zero's transformation. The possibility that extreme isolation could unlock hidden aspects of human consciousness became a subject of interest for psychological warfare specialists, though no successful applications were ever developed. The site where Cosmonaut Zero's orbital module was recovered became the subject of periodic investigation by researchers studying anomalous phenomena. Local inhabitants reported unusual electromagnetic disturbances in the area, and several scientific expeditions documented readings that could not be explained by conventional instrumentation. These investigations were typically terminated by government authorities before any conclusions could be reached. Decades later, when many of the original documents were declassified as part of post-Cold War transparency initiatives, researchers discovered that Cosmonaut Zero's mission had been part of a larger program investigating the relationship between consciousness and cosmic isolation. The program had been based on theoretical work, suggesting that human awareness might function differently in environments completely removed from terrestrial influences, possibly accessing forms of information or understanding that were normally inaccessible. The theoretical framework for these experiments had been developed by a team of scientists who combined expertise in psychology, physics, and what was then called psychical research. Their work suggested that consciousness might not be entirely contained within the brain, but could extend beyond the physical boundaries of the human body under certain conditions. Extreme isolation in the vacuum of space was believed to provide optimal conditions for testing these theories. The results of Cosmonaut Zero's mission supported these theoretical predictions in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the research team. His reports of accessing information beyond his normal knowledge base, his apparent ability to perceive events occurring at distant locations and times, and his eventual transcendence of physical form all suggested that consciousness could indeed operate independently of its normal biological constraints. However, the implications of these findings were considered too dangerous for public knowledge. The possibility that human consciousness could be fundamentally altered through specific environmental conditions raised questions about the nature of identity, reality, and human potential that had far-reaching political and philosophical implications. The decision was made to classify the entire program and suppress any research that might lead to similar conclusions. The personnel who had been involved in monitoring Cosmonaut Zero's mission were subjected to extensive psychological evaluation to ensure their reliability. Many reported persistent dreams about vast, empty spaces and voices speaking from infinite distances. Several requested transfer to other assignments, while others experienced what they described as cosmic claustrophobia, and an overwhelming sense that Earth's atmosphere was too confining after having witnessed someone transcend its limitations. Ground control personnel who had listened to the complete set of transmissions reported lasting changes in their perception of reality. They described feeling that everyday life had become somehow insubstantial, as if the normal world was merely a thin layer covering something vastly more complex and meaningful. These effects persisted for years after the mission, leading to ongoing psychological monitoring of affected personnel. The technology used in Cosmonaut Zero's orbital module was eventually adapted for use in later missions, though the psychological monitoring systems were significantly modified to prevent similar incidents. The life support systems proved highly reliable, and many of their design features became standard in subsequent spacecraft. However, the specific combination of isolation protocols and environmental conditions that had produced Cosmonaut Zero's transformation was never replicated. The official Soviet space program continued to achieve remarkable successes, culminating in numerous orbital missions and eventual lunar exploration. However, none of these achievements carried the same philosophical implications as the mission that had been deliberately erased from history. Cosmonaut Zero's transformation remained unique, a singular example of human consciousness pushed beyond its normal limitations. Years after the Cold War's end, when access to previously classified materials became possible, researchers from various nations attempted to piece together the complete story of Cosmonaut Zero's mission. However, many key documents remained missing, and personnel who might have provided testimony had either died or disappeared. The full extent of the psychological experimentation conducted during the early Soviet space program remained largely unknown. The few surviving records suggested that Cosmonaut Zero's mission had been one of several attempts to explore the boundaries of human consciousness under extreme conditions. Other experiments had involved prolonged isolation in underground facilities, sensory deprivation in specially constructed chambers, and exposure to electromagnetic fields designed to affect brain function. None of these experiments had produced results as dramatic as the Orbital mission, leading researchers to conclude that the cosmic environment itself had been a crucial factor in the transformation. Modern neuroscience has provided some insight into the possible mechanisms behind Cosmonaut Zero's experience. Research into the effects of sensory deprivation on brain function has shown that extreme isolation can lead to significant changes in neural activity, potentially allowing access to normally suppressed mental processes. The complete absence of terrestrial sensory input during orbital flight might have created conditions for consciousness to function in fundamentally different ways. The mathematical equations found in Cosmonaut Zero's notebook have been analyzed extensively by researchers in quantum physics and consciousness studies. The equations describe relationships between observer and observed that were not formally recognized by science until decades after they were written. Their accuracy and sophistication suggest that Cosmonaut Zero had somehow accessed understanding of physical principles that would not be discovered through conventional research for many years. Some researchers have suggested that Cosmonaut Zero's transformation represents evidence for theories of consciousness that extend beyond conventional neuroscience. These theories propose that awareness itself might be a fundamental property of the universe, rather than an emergent property of complex neural activity. Under this interpretation, extreme isolation from terrestrial influences might allow consciousness to connect directly with cosmic-scale information processes. The possibility that similar transformations might occur during long-duration space missions has influenced the design of modern spacecraft and crew selection procedures. Psychological support systems for astronauts now include extensive provisions for maintaining connection with Earth and preventing the kind of isolation that characterized Cosmonaut Zero's mission. However, some researchers argue that these precautions might also prevent access to the expanded forms of consciousness that his experience demonstrated. The legend of Cosmonaut Zero has persisted in various forms, despite official attempts to suppress information about his mission. Rumors of the lost cosmonaut have circulated among space program personnel for decades, often including details that closely match the classified records. These stories have typically been dismissed as folklore, But their persistence suggests that knowledge of the mission has spread beyond those officially authorized to know about it. In recent years, several former Soviet officials have provided testimony about the psychological experimentation programs that operated during the Cold War era. While none have specifically confirmed the details of Cosmonaut Zero's mission, their accounts describe research projects that align closely with the theoretical framework that would have supported such experiments. These testimonies have been largely ignored by mainstream media, but they have attracted attention from researchers studying the history of consciousness research. The question of what actually happened to Cosmonaut Zero remains unresolved. The official explanation of technical malfunction and death during re-entry cannot account for the absence of physical remains or the sophisticated mathematical work found in his notebook. Alternative explanations range from secret extraction by intelligence services to genuine transcendence of normal human limitations. Dr. Volkov's sealed report, which remains classified to this day, is believed to contain his theoretical interpretation of Cosmonaut Zero's transformation. Intelligence sources suggest that the report describes the experience as a successful demonstration of consciousness operating independently of biological constraints, representing a form of human evolution that could be triggered by specific environmental conditions. The implications of such a possibility continue to influence research in fields ranging from neuroscience to space exploration. The idea that human consciousness might be capable of far greater development than commonly understood has attracted interest from various institutions studying human potential. However, the ethical questions surrounding the deliberate induction of such transformations remain largely unexplored. The site of Cosmonaut Zero's launch, Site 17 in Kazakhstan, was abandoned shortly after his mission and subsequently removed from all official maps. Local residents report that the area remains electromagnetically disturbed, with equipment failures and unusual atmospheric phenomena occurring regularly. Scientific expeditions to study these anomalies have been consistently blocked by authorities, suggesting that the site continues to be of interest to government agencies. The recordings of Cosmonaut Zero's transmissions have allegedly been analyzed by artificial intelligence systems designed to detect patterns beyond human comprehension. These analyses have reportedly identified mathematical relationships in his speech patterns that correspond to advanced theories in quantum mechanics and cosmology. However, the results of such analyses remain classified, leaving their significance unclear. Some researchers have proposed that Cosmonaut Zero's mission represents the first documented case of human consciousness making contact with forms of intelligence operating on cosmic scales. His descriptions of conversations with unseen entities, his access to information about past and future events, and his eventual transcendence of physical form could all be interpreted as evidence of communication with intelligences existing beyond normal space and time. The possibility that such contact might be achievable through specific conditions of isolation and sensory deprivation has led to ongoing research programs in various countries. These programs typically operate under extreme classification, making their results unavailable to mainstream scientific study. However, personnel involved in such research have occasionally provided indirect confirmation that consciousness-altering experiments continue to be conducted. The legacy of Cosmonaut Zero's mission extends beyond its immediate scientific implications to questions about the nature of human potential and the responsibilities of those who study consciousness. The deliberate creation of conditions that fundamentally alter human awareness raises ethical issues that were not adequately considered during the Cold War era, and these questions remain relevant as consciousness research continues to advance. Modern space agencies have implemented extensive psychological monitoring and support systems designed to prevent the kind of isolation that characterized Cosmonaut Zero's experience. However, as missions to Mars and other distant destinations are planned, the question of how extreme isolation might affect human consciousness becomes increasingly relevant. The possibility that long-duration space travel might naturally induce consciousness alterations similar to those experienced by Cosmonaut Zero remains a subject of classified research. The mathematical work found in Cosmonaut Zero's notebook continues to influence theoretical research in quantum mechanics and cosmology. Several breakthrough discoveries in these fields have been based on insights that can be traced back to his equations, though this connection is rarely acknowledged in published research. The accuracy of his mathematical descriptions of phenomena that were not understood until decades later suggests that his transformed consciousness had access to information that transcends normal human knowledge. In the end, Cosmonaut Zero's mission remains one of the most significant and disturbing examples of human consciousness pushed beyond its normal boundaries. Whether his transformation represents a genuine evolution of human potential or a cautionary example of the dangers of extreme psychological experimentation continues to be debated by those with access to the classified records. The silence that followed his final transmission continues to echo through the halls of research institutions studying consciousness and space exploration. His voice, preserved in recordings that few have heard, speaks to questions about the nature of human awareness that remain largely unexplored by mainstream science. The empty pressure suit found in his orbital module serves as a reminder that human consciousness might be far more complex and capable than commonly understood, but also that the pursuit of such understanding carries risks that extend beyond individual subjects to the very nature of human identity itself. Years pass, but Site 17 in the Kazakhstan steppes remains abandoned, its concrete structures slowly crumbling under the weight of time and weather. Local shepherds avoid the area, passing down stories of voices that can sometimes be heard on clear nights, speaking in languages that no one recognizes, carrying messages from the vast silence between the stars. The wind through the abandoned launch facility creates sounds that visitors describe as almost like speech, as if the empty spaces are trying to communicate something that human language cannot properly express. Those who have lingered too long in the area report feeling an overwhelming urge to look up at the night sky and listen for transmissions that might still be arriving from somewhere beyond the reach of normal human understanding. And sometimes, on nights when the atmospheric conditions are perfect and radio interference is minimal, amateur radio operators in the region claim to receive brief transmissions in a voice that matches the archived recordings of Cosmonaut Zero. These transmissions consist of mathematical sequences and astronomical coordinates that point to regions of space where nothing should exist, yet where recent observations have begun to detect anomalies that challenge our understanding of cosmic structure and function. The orbital path that Cosmonaut Zero's spacecraft followed has been calculated to have decayed decades ago, yet satellite tracking systems occasionally detect objects in similar trajectories that disappear from monitoring equipment before their nature can be determined. These transient contacts are typically dismissed as instrument error or space debris, but their characteristics match what would be expected from a spacecraft maintaining the same orbital parameters that carried Cosmonaut Zero beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The investigation into these anomalous contacts has been conducted quietly by space agencies around the world, though no official acknowledgement of their existence has ever been made. Tracking data suggests that whatever is creating these signals follows a pattern that corresponds to the original mission profile of Cosmonaut Zero's flight, as if something continues to orbit Earth along the same path he traveled more than 60 years ago. Recent developments in quantum physics have provided theoretical frameworks that could potentially explain Cosmonaut Zero's transformation and continued presence in orbit. Research into quantum consciousness suggests that awareness might not be entirely dependent on biological processes, but could exist as a pattern of information that persists independently of its original physical substrate. Under this interpretation, extreme isolation in the cosmic environment might have allowed Cosmonaut Zero's consciousness to transition from a biological to a quantum state. The mathematical equations found in his notebook have been subjected to analysis using advanced computational methods that were not available during the 1960s. These analyses have revealed that his equations describe quantum mechanical processes that govern the relationship between consciousness and space-time itself. The accuracy of these descriptions suggests that Cosmonaut Zero somehow gained direct access to fundamental principles of reality that mainstream science is only beginning to understand. Several research institutions have attempted to replicate the conditions of Cosmonaut Zero's mission using modern technology and safety protocols. These experiments have involved placing volunteer subjects in isolation chambers that simulate the sensory environment of orbital spaceflight, while monitoring their neural activity using advanced brain imaging techniques. However, none of these controlled studies have produced results approaching the dramatic transformation documented in the original mission records. The difference appears to lie not just in the technological simulation of cosmic isolation, but in the complete removal from Earth's electromagnetic and gravitational environment that can only be achieved through actual spaceflight. The cosmic radiation exposure, the absence of terrestrial magnetic fields, and the profound psychological impact of seeing Earth from space may all be necessary components for inducing the kind of consciousness transformation that Cosmonaut Zero experienced. Modern astronauts who have spent extended periods in space report psychological experiences that echo some aspects of Cosmonaut Zero's transmissions, though none have approached the complete transformation he underwent. Long-duration mission personnel describe feelings of cosmic consciousness, profound shifts in perspective about human existence, and occasionally brief experiences of what they describe as telepathic communication with unknown sources. These reports are typically attributed to the known psychological effects of space travel and are rarely studied in detail. The possibility that Cosmonaut Zero's transformation represents a natural human response to cosmic isolation has influenced the design of psychological support systems for future deep space missions. Plans for missions to Mars and beyond include extensive provisions for maintaining crew connection to Earth, partly to prevent the kind of isolation that might trigger consciousness alterations. However, some researchers argue that such precautions might also prevent crew members from accessing enhanced forms of awareness that could be beneficial for long-duration space exploration. The ethical implications of deliberately inducing consciousness transformations similar to Cosmonaut Zero's continue to be debated in classified forums. The potential benefits of enhanced human awareness must be weighed against the risks of fundamental changes to human identity and the possibility that such transformations might be irreversible. The absence of any evidence that Cosmonaut Zero retained his original personality or memories after his transformation serves as a cautionary reminder of the stakes involved in such experimentation. Intelligence agencies have maintained interest in the consciousness research spawned by Cosmonaut Zero's mission, though their specific applications remain classified. Documents released through Freedom of Information requests suggest that various governments have funded research into consciousness alteration techniques, possibly seeking applications in interrogation, psychological warfare, or intelligence gathering. However, the success or failure of such programs remains largely unknown to civilian researchers. The original Site-17 launch facility in Kazakhstan has become the focus of unofficial scientific pilgrimages by researchers studying consciousness and anomalous phenomena. Despite official restrictions on access to the area, scientists have documented unusual electromagnetic readings, gravitational anomalies, and atmospheric disturbances that appear to emanate from the former launch site. These phenomena occur in patterns that correspond to the orbital period of Cosmonaut Zero's original mission, suggesting some form of continuing connection between his transformed consciousness and the location where his journey began. Local folklore in the region has incorporated stories of the lost cosmonaut into traditional narratives about spirits and otherworldly beings. Nomadic herders speak of a guardian presence that watches over the steppes from the sky, sometimes providing warnings about weather changes or dangerous conditions. These stories typically describe communications that occur without words, as direct transfer of knowledge that appears in the mind without any apparent source. The technological legacy of Cosmonaut Zero's mission extends beyond its consciousness research implications to practical advances in space technology. The life support systems designed for his extended isolation mission proved remarkably reliable and have influenced the development of closed-loop life support systems still used in modern spacecraft. The psychological monitoring equipment developed for his mission became the foundation for crew health monitoring systems that are standard on contemporary space missions. However, the specific combination of technologies and protocols used in Cosmonaut Zero's mission has never been exactly replicated. Key personnel involved in the original design were either transferred to other projects or disappeared entirely from official records, taking their specialized knowledge with them. Attempts to reverse engineer the complete system from available documentation have been unsuccessful, suggesting that crucial information was deliberately withheld from written records. The philosophical implications of Cosmonaut Zero's transformation continue to influence academic research in consciousness studies, though most researchers are unaware of the classified source material that originally inspired these investigations. Theories about the relationship between consciousness and cosmic environment have developed significantly since the 1960s. Providing increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding how extreme isolation might affect human awareness. Modern neuroscience has identified specific brain regions and neural networks that appear to be involved in maintaining normal human consciousness and identity. Research suggests that disrupting these networks through sensory deprivation, electromagnetic exposure, or chemical intervention can produce altered states of consciousness that approach some aspects of Cosmonaut Zero's reported experiences. However, achieving the complete transformation he underwent would require interventions that extend far beyond what current technology can safely accomplish. The question of whether Cosmonaut Zero's consciousness continues to exist in some form remains unresolved. Radio telescopes occasionally detect signal patterns from space that match characteristics of human speech. Though these are typically attributed to natural cosmic phenomena or equipment interference, however, detailed analysis of these signals has revealed mathematical structures that correspond to equations found in Cosmonaut Zero's notebook, suggesting that his transformed consciousness might indeed be attempting to communicate with Earth. Recent advances in quantum communication technology have raised the possibility of establishing direct contact with consciousness patterns that exist independently of biological substrates. Several classified research programs are reportedly investigating methods for detecting and communicating with quantum consciousness entities, though the results of such research remain highly secret. If successful, These technologies might eventually enable communication with whatever Cosmonaut Zero became during his transformation. The impact of Cosmonaut Zero's mission extends beyond scientific research to questions about human destiny and the future of consciousness evolution. His transformation suggests that human awareness might be capable of development far beyond what is normally considered possible, potentially representing a form of evolution that could be triggered by exposure to cosmic environments. As humanity prepares for eventual expansion beyond Earth, the possibility that space travel itself might fundamentally alter human consciousness becomes increasingly relevant. Space agencies planning future missions to Mars and other destinations must consider the possibility that crew members might undergo consciousness transformations similar to Cosmonaut Zero's. The isolation and cosmic exposure involved in such missions could potentially trigger psychological changes that would fundamentally alter the nature of human space exploration. Whether such changes would be beneficial or detrimental remains unclear, but their possibility cannot be ignored in mission planning. The mathematical work left behind by Cosmonaut Zero continues to influence theoretical physics research, though its origins are rarely acknowledged in published literature. Several major breakthroughs in quantum mechanics and cosmology have been based on insights that can be traced back to his equations, suggesting that his transformed consciousness provided access to knowledge that transcends normal human understanding. The implications of such enhanced awareness for human development remain largely unexplored. Educational institutions studying consciousness research occasionally receive anonymous donations of historical documents related to early space program psychological experiments. These materials typically include fragments of personnel files, training protocols, and technical specifications that provide additional context for understanding Cosmonaut Zero's mission. However, the documents are invariably incomplete, with crucial information removed or redacted, maintaining the mystery surrounding the full extent of the consciousness research programs. The few surviving personnel from the original mission have maintained absolute silence about their experiences, despite numerous attempts by researchers to obtain their testimony. Those who agreed to speak at all have provided only the most general descriptions of their work, avoiding any specific details about Cosmonaut Zero's training, mission, or transformation. This continued secrecy suggests that the implications of his mission remain sensitive to government and intelligence agencies decades after the events occurred. International cooperation in space exploration has been influenced by the precedent set by Cosmonaut Zero's mission. Agreements governing human spaceflight include provisions for sharing information about psychological effects of extended isolation, partly to prevent the deliberate induction of consciousness alterations without appropriate safeguards. However, these agreements also include classifications that allow certain research to remain secret, creating the possibility that consciousness experimentation continues under different auspices. The legacy of Cosmonaut Zero serves as both inspiration and warning for humanity's future in space. His transformation demonstrates the potential for human consciousness to transcend its normal limitations when exposed to cosmic environments, suggesting possibilities for enhanced awareness and understanding that could benefit all of humanity. However, his complete loss of original identity also illustrates the risks involved in pushing consciousness beyond its evolutionary boundaries. As Earth's population looks toward eventual expansion beyond the solar system, the questions raised by Cosmonaut Zero's mission become increasingly urgent. Will extended exposure to cosmic environments naturally trigger consciousness evolution in human space travelers? Can such transformations be controlled or directed to enhance human capabilities while preserving individual identity? The answers to these questions may determine the nature of humanity's future among the stars. The silence that enveloped Cosmonaut Zero during his final transmission continues to echo through the decades, carrying implications that extend far beyond the individual tragedy of one man lost to the cosmos. His voice, preserved in recordings that few have heard, speaks to questions about human potential that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence itself. In the end, Cosmonaut Zero's mission represents both humanity's greatest achievement and its most profound mystery. He ventured beyond the boundaries of normal human experience and discovered possibilities for consciousness that we are only beginning to understand. Whether his transformation represents evolution or dissolution, triumph or tragedy, remains an open question that will likely persist as long as humans continue to reach for the stars. The empty pressure suit found in his orbital module stands as a monument to the unknown potential of human consciousness when freed from terrestrial constraints. It reminds us that the cosmos may offer opportunities for awareness and understanding that transcend anything possible on Earth, but at costs that we are only beginning to comprehend. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, something that was once a man named Cosmonaut Zero continues its eternal orbit, transformed beyond recognition, yet somehow still connected to the small blue planet where humanity dreams of touching the infinite and discovering what lies beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The recordings of his voice still whisper across the void, carrying mathematical truths and cosmic secrets that await our understanding, messages from a consciousness that found its way home to the universe itself.